Welcome to the next episode of Take It Easy podcast. This episode is about heat pumps. I sat down with Nathan from BetaTalk podcast, and he's just asked him loads of questions about heating pumps and the heating engineering industry. Um, it was a very good conversation. I've enjoyed very much. This was the second one of my video podcast attempts. So if you're listening to this as an audio, you can also watch us on YouTube. As always, I would like to thank my amazing patrons on patreon.com/takeitev. This would not be possible without you. Please subscribe, smash that like button, and all that jazz. And what else can I say? I've got quite a few episodes coming up that are, I think, very good conversations, and just stay tuned for next stuff. But now, just enjoy the podcast about heat pumps with Nathan. Get on. Anyway, welcome to Take It Easy podcast, Nathan. I've heard you on a lot of podcasts before, and obviously you're on podcasts as well. And heat pumps and sort of heating in general is like a subject for a lot of EV owners. It's one thing that happens quite often with people who buy electric cars or are just generally interested in electric cars is that they all of a sudden notice other things like solar panels and heat pumps and all sorts of other things, and they quite often change their diets as well. They go basically a bit more eco-sustainable in their lives. And I actually asked this morning people on Twitter if they have any questions about heat pumps. Kind of late. I should have asked them a couple of days ago, but I've got my own set of questions anyway. And quite a lot of people who I know propped up and said, "Oh yeah, we're getting a heat pump soon. I've got this question. I'm getting a heat pump soon. I'm going to have this question." And it's all of a sudden like, "Oh, I didn't know that all these people looked at heat pumps because we just talked about EVs and stuff like that." So it's I think it's a subject that is very very much on the books these days. And obviously, never mind the fact that we've got this whole situation with Russia, and people are trying to minimize the dependency on gas. That's obviously a massive thing, and the rising costs of gas and electricity is another reason. So can I? Because I could probably talk about it myself, but I'm sure you're better suited than me. Can you briefly describe to people what do you do yourself, obviously, and what is a heat pump and why do we care about heat pumps in the first place?
Well, so if I describe, so hello, and thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. So I suppose that's the first thing to mention. I run a podcast. I host a podcast called BetaTalk, which is all about sort of renewable heating technology. So I did my apprenticeship. How old am I now? 51. So yeah, I did my apprenticeship back in '86. I did it with the Ministry of Defence on a USAF air base. And so, but my family has quite a sort of unprecedented historical background in heating. So central heating is relatively quite new, actually. I mean, there'd be people listening to this podcast, for instance, that would have grown up without central heating. People had some sort of heating. They might have had an electric bar fire or a gas fire in the lounge, but then central heating started to become popular. My grandfather brought the Swedish oil burner technology over to this country. So he was sort of renowned as one of the leading oil combustion experts in Europe. He was definitely the leading combustion expert in the UK. My great uncle was lead engineer for Unilever and the European energy manager for Unilever, and my dad was one of the technical reps for Triangle Red Fire, which was a prominent boiler back in the 80s. And my cousin is the UK's leading acoustic sensitive air conditioning. So he expert. So he works on a lot of the radio stations, a lot of the very famous recording studios, because obviously they need. So I suppose that's a good segue into the fact that heat pumps have been around us a long time, and heat pumps. I suppose the first thing to say, heat pump is a very generic term. Okay. So there's all different sorts of heat pumps, and So basically, a heat pump does what it says on the tin. It pumps heat from one place to another, and it uses vapor compression technology. Now, vapor compression technology has been with us a long time. Lots of people listening to your podcast would have been heated with it today, for instance, because it's everywhere outside of our homes. So when you go into your shops, your supermarkets, people in factories, offices, you're generally being heated a lot of the time with vapor compression technology. Now, a lot of people will look up and they will call it aircon or AC. It's not actually true AC. It's actually when you look up, it's going to be comfort cooling and comfort heating systems using vapor compression technology. We'll talk about that in a bit. AC air conditioning does exist, but it's actually very rare, and it does what it says on the tin. It conditions air to very strict parameters, so things like controlling humidity. So you'll find it in certain rooms in museums where they're storing certain artifacts that they need to be stored at certain humidities. The British Library will have a couple of rooms where it is. So air conditioning, even though the industry calls it air conditioning, obviously the Americans call their comfort cooling systems air conditioning. It's actually comfort cooling, comfort heating, and it's been around us for a long, long time in in the spaces outside of our homes. So that's one thing I think people, when they talk about heat pumps, and especially even government. So before Bayes, you had DEC, and you would have had people talking about heat pumps who who didn't realise they were in offices that's being heated with heat pumps. And some of the radio stations, for instance, where they have people come on that dismiss heat pumps, ironically, are in rooms and studios that are it's been controlled with heat pump technology, because my cousin put a lot of it in. I mean, classic FM. I think we put the VRF system into that in 1991. So it's been around us a long time. It's not new technology. District heating. There was a John Sumner in my home city, Norwich, built a heat pump system that took heat from the river and heated the factory, the Gerald's factory, which is a printing press. So that was in 1948. 1951, the London Festival House had a heat pump system put in. Now, unfortunately, the people who designed that didn't realise how much installation that had soundproofing. And so it ended up that the heat pump was oversized. And of course, it was going on, off, and it would have been a centrifugal compressor back then with capacitors to turn it on and off. So it made a lot of noise, so they got rid of it. And of course, that made the media. That one made the media. The one that was 2 years before it, which has been designed perfect and working up until the 2000s, no one talked about. So heat pump technology isn't new, and it does work. So, but there's different types. So the type I'm talking about, like obviously in our offices and things like that, is air-to-air vapor compression technology. The types that people generally talk about for their homes are going to be, it's still an air source heat pump. The source of energy is from the air, but it's to heat water, so it's air to water.
Okay. So what you're telling me basically is that the papers and journalists in general seeking drama or just looking for negative stories is not a new thing these days.
No, never has been. I think one of the problems with mainstream media is that they're now their own little mini social media sites. So I mean, I get the BBC contact me, the Telegraph contact me to sort of verify certain things, but I think if they realise, if they make a controversial story on their own platforms where people can comment, the more comments you get, I should imagine you get the more advertising. So I think the more controversial they make the stories, the better, really. So, which is there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation out there.
Yeah, I think it's a human condition to like we're more attracted to negative stories because we have to be on our feet, right? In case something bad happens, we have to react quickly. Whereas when everything's fine and we have the room to breathe, we don't care about it as much as about the negative stories. But yeah, I like this story about the how old are the heat pumps and how sort of widely not available, but like how widely installed they are, and we just don't realize that they're there because it's just to a regular person they all look like air conditioning units because that's what we used to, right? The fan outside, and if you go on holidays to Spain or whatever, there's aircon everywhere, and you see this the outside unit with a massive fan, and to everyone who looks at a heat pump unit, the air to air heat pump or air source heat pump, it kind of looks like a big air conditioning unit. And we
which is a heat pump.
I think as an aircon.
Yeah, which is a heat pump. I mean, basically, a heat pump is
Yes, yeah.
essentially four
Um,
things: your condenser, your evaporator, your compressor, and then a metering device. And it's just refrigerant flowing around it. And you're pumping heat from a cold place or a colder energy state to a hot place. Because the way to think about heat is it's a bit like, if you imagine a hill and you've got water at the top of the hill, it's going to run downhill. Water always runs downhill. It runs from a high place to a low place. And that's exactly what heat does. It'll move from a high temperature to a low temperature. And a bit like the water or a river on a hill, the steeper the hill, the quicker the river will flow. And that's the same with heat. The greater the gradient of heat. So if it's colder outside and you want your room inside 20 or 21, if it's colder outside, heat will move quicker. So that's what heat does. Now, if you want to move that water up the hill, what do we use? We use a pump. So it's exactly why they're called heat pumps, because if we want to move energy from a cold place to a hotter place, we have to pump it. And of course, obviously, people then ask, well, how's their energy? How's their heat energy if it's like 0 degrees outside? How can it be? Well, it's all to do. Your atoms are moving about, your molecules are moving about. The coldest possible temperature is absolute zero, which is minus 273.15 degrees Celsius. So above that, there's energy. As long as atoms are moving, there's energy. So at 0 degrees, there's huge amounts of energy. And we can move that.
yes.
We can move that using the vapor compression cycle, and we've been doing it for a long time. We do it with our food. I mean, and all the food that's getting transported around the world, and all the warehouses it gets stored in, and the shipping, and the vans that bring it to your home, they're all using vapor compression technology to keep that food cooler.
Yeah, that's what you do in your fridge, right, or in your freezer. Is that the same principle?
Yeah,
Or am I
exactly the
talking
same.
rubbish now?
Exactly the same. I mean, people tend to say it's a fridge in reverse. There's nothing in reverse. It's exactly the same. You've got a compressor, evaporator, condenser
Okay.
core, and a metering device. There's nothing reverse at all about it. It's exactly what you're doing. So a fridge, if you put an apple or whatever you want to put in your fridge, that's got heat energy in it. And you're moving heat energy into the evaporator, and then gets compressed, and then the heat gets chucked outside the condenser.
So you so the beta talk or beta talk, that's the podcast that you're doing, but you also have a whole like educational platform, right? Can you talk about that a little bit more? And one of the questions that I often get is, how do we know um, that a heat pump engineer or a heat engineer is a good one? How do I get a good installation of a heat pump? Because everyone's hearing about stories where somebody's got a heat pump installed in their house and it doesn't work. I presume it's just like 10 stories over thousands of installations, but obviously, like we said earlier, when there's a negative story, it just kind of prevails in people's minds and just spreads around like wildfire. So if you can talk about your side of things in terms of the educational platform, but also as a home owner who's not very technically savvy, how do we make sure that we get the sort of the right person to come over and actually install the heat pump correctly?
Well, to be honest, the homeowner is in a very not a great position, because it is very hard to ascertain who's competent. And yes, so I suppose the thing I'm kind of perhaps not, I mean, I never say I'm a great engineer, because I'm not. I know the good engineers, so I'm kind of known for knowing who the good engineers are. And also my sort of real expertise is how we train people up, and skills, and learning is completely different to education. Lots of people think learning is about education. The education is a sort of bureaucratic model that's completely different to learning. Consumers have got a problem, because there is this thing about how do you know who is competent, and unfortunately we've got a system, rightly or wrongly, is where if you're certified and accredited, you're deemed competent, and you're not. And it's not just me saying that. We've got sort of what the Bays have just done a heat pump trial, 750 homes. They obviously use MCS accredited installation companies, the same as the Energy Savings Trust trials of 2009, 2011 did. And what they found was there's a very, very wide spectrum of competence with accredited and sort of certified people. So it's very, very hard for the consumer. Unless you're in the game, how can you assess competence? I mean, obviously peer assessment is any industry. I mean, if you and I went and watched a Formula One race, and we went down into the pits and we went to all the different car manufacturers and we said to all their mechanics, who are the best 3 mechanics? You'd probably tend to find that all the mechanics would name the same sort of 3 people. So within any industry, whether it's computer coding or making EVs, I suppose, people tend to know who is really good. So my learning platform kind of builds on that, this whole thing of peer-to-peer learning, hive mindset, because I think people are starting to realise our industry is very, very technical. I mean, unfortunately, I think over time, rightly or wrongly, I don't know whose fault it is, but consumers do tend to look at us as tradespeople. We're not particularly that intelligent. We come in, which is quite strange because fundamentally, with some demographics, we're keeping people alive. I mean, if you're elderly and you go without heat in the into winter, it's critical. We obviously, the World Health Organization describes plumbers as the frontline health workers, above doctors, because as my old lecturer used to say, we prevent more death and disease than doctors can cure. So sanitation does do that. But we have got the situation where we have kind of, people are more prepared to spend more on their yearly subscriptions to Netflix and Spotify and their phones than they do on their heating. And that's not society's fault. It's just that's how it's happened. So with the boiler industry, for instance, the UK gas boiler industry became the biggest gas boiler industry in the world up until 2016. It's now third in the world. It's the biggest in Europe by far. And of course, the boiler industry just want to sell stuff. So our industry kind of got dumbed down. It really did get dumbed down. I mean, there's a lot of theoretical science involved in our industry, and you've got some great engineers out there who can really, there's a lot of boiler makes and models, and there's some great engineers out there who can really repair this stuff, get it working. But our boiler industry has incentivized actually replacing the boiler rather than get it to work. I mean, they'll fly you abroad if you put enough boilers in as a loyalty scheme. Wow. So we're in this situation where it's been a race to the bottom. You've got engineers that are kind of not as high a skill as what they kind of could be. There's enthusiasm around that actually though, but and then of course society probably doesn't value us as much as what they probably could, and maybe heat pumps is the transition or the catalyst to make people think, oh crikey, heating is actually quite complex. And I know government. I mean, I speak to some people in Bays, and obviously the climate change committee. I speak to people in there, and they're starting to realise, wow, this stuff is actually quite complex, quite technical, and there's perhaps not that many people out there that really know what they're doing. And that's why I started the podcast, because government was listening to all their consultancies, but they were using theoretical engineers, university. Nothing wrong with them. They're very clever people, but they want on the ground engineers. They'd not really encountered this stuff, and so I wanted to start a podcast that disseminated the voice of really good on the ground engineers that encounter this stuff day in, day out, because obviously their voice is quite important, because they're also interfacing with the most important group of people, which of course is the consumers. It's the engineers that meet the consumers and have to solve their problems. So it's very hard for a consumer to understand who a competent engineer is. Very hard.
I mean, it is kind of the same with any trades. You've got checker trade and organizations like that, and I've had plenty of people that had very high scores on checker trade, and they did their job poorly, and we just had to deal with it kind of off-site, because nobody wants to have a poor rating on the checker trade or websites like that, which is why loads of people have very high ratings, right?
Well, them models don't work and they can't work. No one, unless they're industry, no one can assess my competence. They can assess my timekeeping, politeness, and tidiness. So that's what I'm getting rated for if I was on Checker Trader. No one can assess my technical competence. So that them sort of there's quite a lot of them rate this and check this, and they can't actually assess competence. So that they're a system that's actually not perhaps working that well, if I'm honest.
No, and it's good that we have people like yourself who are kind of, because if government's only listening to purely academic types, the other part of the conversation would be commercial, and like you said, then you've got a race to the bottom, which is not always in the interest of the consumer. So you want to have a voice that actually represents the consumer interest rather than just the commercial interest of businesses manufacturing boilers or whatever trinkets they're trying to sell. So I think that's very good. In terms of the okay, so as a consumer, like obviously I'm going to have a very hard time finding out if my heat pump installation has been a good one. And what happens if somebody, because this is I'm not trying to be just a negative here, but this is what I hear often from members of my family or other people when I'm considering a heat pump. Because we have currently a gas boiler in the house, but we're getting a house extension built soon, and we want to get a heat pump. And everyone's like, oh, but they're not going to work. It's going to cost you a lot of money. This is a massive outlay of capital. You're going to have to replace all your radiators. Or you're going to have to get underfloor heating and this. And I'm sure you've heard all of this. What do you say to these people? Like, how do you deal with this this sort of negative comment? And also on top of it, the other thing is that kind of annoys me is that when I talk to builders who are going to build our extension, their point of view is like, why are you getting a heat pump? Everyone's going to come up with a hydrogen solution that's been tested and proven up north, the mythical trial up north, which I have no idea where that took place, and was so successful that I've never read about it anywhere. But how do you deal with all these things? Because I'm sure you've heard it all.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because obviously growing up in heating engineering, no one ever talked about heating outside of heating engineers, I suppose. And but the whole world is now looking at our industry. It really is looking at our industry, and people at Bays listen to my podcast as part of their learning development, for instance. So people are now really looking at it. People are always going to know that, and there's been some negative. There's a lot. The thing is with a heat pump system, you've got to get it right. You've got to get the design right. I mean, people think you can't. People say we've got leaky homes and you can't heat homes up with heat pumps. Well, of course you can. It's the laws of thermodynamics. So you can heat a marquee up with a heat pump, and that's pretty leaky. You can heat a marquee up with people. So bodies emit 100 watts when you're moving about 80 watts when you're not moving about. So everyone's been to a party or something where it's all got a bit hot, and that's body heat. And no one's body went over 37 degrees. So this is the other myth that you can't heat buildings up with low temperature. Well, of course you can. And actually, body heat can be a problem. So, for instance, when all the musicians, extra musicians came together to record Band Aid, lots of body heat in the studio in 1984. So my cousin had to go there to Psalm Studios, and that was owned by Trevor Horn. Anyone that remembers Buggles, Video Killed. So he went and tweaked the system. And then 2014, extra musicians, we went there the day before to tweak that system so that can remove more heat. It's a heat pump system. So body heat can actually be a problem.
Okay.
So you can heat things up. You just got to design it right. It's as simple as that. You've got to design it right. And this is where there's a different. I mean, everyone talks about the cost parity, of a boiler system. Boilers you can just sling on the wall. It's a high flame temperature. It's going to heat your house up, and it can heat it up quickly as well. And we're all used to this thing of where you just flick it on, it can heat your home up quickly. Heat pumps don't work like that. You don't use them the same way. But they can definitely heat up your premises if it's designed correctly. So again, unfortunately for the consumer, they've got to find someone that knows that. We're obviously now got a situation where all sorts of people realise there's money in this industry, and there's some very clever people that know how to sort of get finance or whatever. So they'll come into the industry, they'll go and chuck all this stuff in. It's not going to be designed that great, and the poor old consumer is going to have some very high electricity prices. But if you have a system that's designed really, really well, it's going to work fine. But yeah, so we've got a problem of not everyone knows how to design the systems really, really well. And we might see a little bit of a split. So your average engineer probably won't know too much about the design, but they can easily fit the stuff. And so you're going to get this sort of two separate cohorts: designers, engineers. I mean, we might have to see a bit of a change how the industry works, because our industry is a sole trader industry. Never used to be. So it used to be employed by the gas boards, regional gas boards, and the councils, and that's 60s and 70s. And then sort of the 80s, we shifted towards a sole trader industry. We might see a different way that sort of changes. So you might start to see sort of more SMEs, sort of people banded together. But that's going to be hard for people to sort of adjust to sometimes. But we've got to get there, and we've got to bring the skill level up. I mean, the skill level is a bit of a challenge, but that's the one I'm working on.
Do you think it's ever going to change that? Are we ever going to get to the point where the heat pumps are kind of like gas boilers, where you can just chuck them on the wall, and
No.
and they're going to be able to? No, there's just it's just a principle of the of how it works, essentially, just the physics of it.
Yeah.
That's not going
Yeah.
to allow it. Okay,
Yeah. No, you have to you
but
have to
if I
design
say
properly.
had a yeah, if I had a terrible installation, because obviously that's going to happen to people. Uh, uh, can somebody just come in and fix it easily, or is it a massive outlay then to get things right? I mean, it kind of depends on the individual cases, but say the system wasn't optimized properly, or for whatever reason, or because I'm sure it's things like insulation of the house. You can always improve on that. That's an easy thing, but I'm sure there's more. I know enough about physics, because I've been trained uh, as an engineer, um, mechanical engineering, but it's still engineering, so physics still works the same way. Uh, although I know nothing about heating, other than just all the theory stuff. But I presume that things like the pipes and the diameters of pipes, or where the pipes are, or how the radiators are connected, and where they are in the room. That all matters very much with a heat pump, whereas with a boiler, like you said, you just chuck it in. It generates a lot of heat, or heats up the water to a higher temperature, so you don't have to worry about all these things.
Yeah, boilers are very
I'm
forgiving.
trying to find a question in there.
Well, boilers
Yeah,
are very forgiving, but unfortunately, once again, condensing boilers were mandated in 2005, and ironically, a condensing boiler is for a low temperature system. So if you look at Sweden have had low temperature systems. It was mandated in 1984, I think, 55-degree max. I mean, this is the thing. You don't need these high temperatures to heat your home. I mean, I know people are used to hot radiators. I mean, if you go back historically, there's some reasons why everything was hot. But you don't need these hot radiators in the majority of homes. I know everyone thinks we've got leaky homes, but actually, when you measure heat loss from a home, average across all the building archetypes is around 6 to 10 kilowatts. That's what we call it DOT, design outside temperature. So the average coldest day in this country is -3. So we design our systems to around about that. So as long as we got enough power, enough joules per second, which is what your watts are, as long as we've got enough power to meet that demand when it's -3, because remember, heat is moving at different speeds depending on what your outside temperature is. And so basically, the way to think of a heat pump is you work out what your home needs, you get the heat pump size for that, well, you can find the heat pumps for any size. You then have to have your emitters, which are your radiators or your underfloor heating, to be able to deliver that heat that quickly. And then your pipe work has to be sized so it can get one to the other. So then, them three things. So that's design, and
yeah,
that's why sometimes people say, well, why aren't heat pump systems the same cost as we have in a boiler? Well, there's a lot of off-site work that goes on. So when people go and put a heat pump system, good engineers will go and design, go and survey the property, and then come away and they spend a lot of time designing it, calculating it, procuring all the different items you will need, because each home is different. It really, really is. We're in a heterogeneous society or a heterogeneous building stock. Every home is completely different. So they will design what they need for that particular property. And that's where the time, there's a lot of time that goes into that. It's not just turning up and actually putting the stuff in and the hours you're there when you're actually at site. There's a lot going on. You might need to do a DNO application because there might be and planning permissions for sometimes is involved. And that's all done off site, you see. So that's when people talk about cost parity of boiler, that's not going to happen because someone can go in and put a boiler in half a day without doing any design, not
okay,
cleaning the system or anything. So yeah, so that you get the bet, you're buying into a higher level of service, so that it's always going to be a bit of a different cost.
okay. Do you think the cost of it will ever come down, to the levels that people are used to, or is it just is now that we're going to move, away from the gas boilers, um, is heating going to be a bit more of a service rather than chuck it on the wall and forget? Because it's obviously uh, people like British Gas and other companies have been already looking at charging people monthly subscription, for servicing and stuff like that. Is that going to be a norm for heating systems in the future? So you basically you give a tenner a month for your heating engineer to be on call and kind of help, maintaining your system and all that, or is do you see that ever changing? Because obviously, like I said, heat pumps have been around forever, or for a very long time, as far as we're concerned. But things will have to be like every product that becomes, uh, you know, becomes something that's in every house, changes, right? Things get normalized and adjusted for a regular consumer when they're everywhere. Do you think that's going to happen to heat pumps, or do you think they're kind of ready as they are and it's just going to be as it is now?
Well, the technology's been there. Yeah, the technology's ready. I mean, a lot of people think heat pumps are expensive. I mean, if you're talking air to water, which is like your monoblock systems, and you do get split air to water systems as well. A 6 kilowatt system, you're going to get for about two grand. So you can get 6 kilowatt systems for the actual monoblock for 2 grand. Premium brands would be about 3.5 grand. So it's not. I think people, when they read these news reports like 10,000, 15,000, they think the actual heat pump costs it, but it's not. It's the actual install. So you've got to bear it in mind. We're not just going in and changing a boiler anymore, which is what 2005, we probably should have gone in and changed the boiler and the heating system, so it became a low temperature heating system, which is what they're designed to do. When you talk about costs of vapor compression technology, when we talk about things what people call air conditioning, that's very cheap. So you can actually heat your home with comfort cooling, comfort heating equipment. So you can buy a 4 kilowatt outside unit, 580 quid, indoor unit, 200 quid, maybe one for upstairs, one for downstairs. That's quite cheap technology. And that's ubiquitous technology. That dwarfs the boiler industry, that kind of stuff. But when we talk about air to water stuff, that's still a very small niche. So, millions and millions of boilers being made around the world, but the air to water stuff is a very small niche. So obviously these big companies that make all this stuff, the compressors and metering devices and different fan coils, it's if the numbers, I mean, we're a small country, but if the numbers increase, you're going to get a little bit of cost comes down with the actual product. But when it comes to actual costs coming down for the actual engineers, if they're spending all this time designing, that cost isn't going to come down too much. And there is an argument, why should it? Because you're having a very good level of, as long as you're a good engineer, and some consumers are going to, unfortunately, have a lot of rubbish put in. But if you've got a good engineer coming around, they're worth their salt. They really are. This is very technical stuff. And I think society's now starting to realise that. It's very complex. You imagine if you're linking up a heat pump system with PV batteries, solar thermal, your EV charging, very complex stuff. And I think people are going to have to get used to that's, you pay for what you get, don't you? You pay for a good service. It's not going to be an 800 quid boiler change, no.
And presumably once you get a heat pump installed properly, barring sort of any major issue with the hardware itself, if you're not going to have to change it probably for quite a long time, so you're not going to have to do any of these expensive bits of work, right? It's just one of those things that you just do and kind of maintain it to a good level.
Yeah, in a sense. So obviously, if you've got a good engineer go in and they survey the property and they think, 40% of your radiators might need upgrading, and we've got some pipe work that needs upgrading here. Obviously, that gets done. That's costly, but once that's done, it's done. It's always worth your listeners realise that if you want a really efficient system, there's one rule you have to remember, and that's you need to narrow the delta T between your source temperature and your sink temperature. And I'll probably better explain that. So your source temperature. So with an air source heat pump, air is your source. That's where the energy is coming from. And then your sink temperature is the flow temperature around your radiators. And the closer you can get them two together, the more efficient your system will be. And people talk about the coefficient of performance, COP. So if it's zero outside, but I've managed to get a system that at zero can keep my home at 20 degrees with 35 degree waters in the radiator. That 35 degree is quite close to zero. Well, it's closer than if I had to have 55 degree water running around the rads. So the narrower you can get them two temperatures, or the closer you can get them two temperatures together. And that's where design comes into it. So when you design, you're looking at, radiators have become so important. I mean, emitters have always been important, but the radiators become very, very important, or the way you emit heat into your room. because the more surface area you can get to be able to get it into the room at the speed you want, depending on the outside temperature. I mean, because you've got to remember, good heat pump systems are weather compensated. They're changing, they're varying the power they put into the room dependent on what's outside. And our boilers should be doing that as well. So we've got weather compensating boilers. But unfortunately, because it's such a mass market, I mean, we've got the Hive thermostat, for instance. So lots of people like it. It's a smart thermostat you can use. It's got geofencing. You can use it on your phone. It's actually not a smart thermostat. It's a non-off stat. It just tells your boiler to come on or off. There are smart stats that tell your boiler to modulate depending on the weather, because obviously if it's milder day, you don't need so much energy going into your room. When it's a colder day, you need a bit more energy, and you can modulate the boiler a lot more efficient. And of course, now with fuel prices, people are starting to realise it's not just about turning your room stat down; it's about lowering them flow temperatures coming out of your heating source, because then you're using less fuel. So heat pump systems modulate with weather compensation. Unfortunately, we've got companies going in, putting them in and actually setting the flow temperature. So that's not really good practice. You want it to be modulating with the weather.
Yeah. With the other question that I had from people is whether you can still use. In our case, we've got Tado, which is another one of those systems that kind of you've got a TRV on each rad that regulates the flow and temperature in each room separately, which is actually quite nice, because that way, if we're not in the living space upstairs during the day when I'm in the office, there's no need for the master bedroom to be heated, for instance. So there's obviously less output. Can you use those systems still with the heat pump, or do you have to set up everything and kind of just let it flow? Because whoever, like I've spoken to multiple heat pump engineers, and the one of them would tell me, no, your heat pump has to run as much as possible, so you don't want it cycled. Others will say, no, it's fine, you can have individual TRVs on radiators still with a heat pump. And I don't understand why there's such a massive discrepancy between their points of view.
It's a very conscientious subject. The control industry is very, very powerful. So I suppose the famous players are Honeywell. I mean, you have to remember Honeywell made all the napalm and cluster bombs and landmines for the Vietnam War. They're a very big company, and they like to be in every single market. So TRVs sort of come around with boiler systems, and so the idea is, you shut off rooms that you're not in. With with heat pump systems, and all the top engineers that are in this game, they like to and I've done a podcast on it. You don't really want to be zoning. They call it microclimate. You don't really want individual zones in your home. You want to basically have a nice open system. So, because if you're restricting flow, your heat pump is having to cope with that. It's not so bad with a boiler system, but of course the controls company. I mean, Tado I get on very well with. I like Tado. Tado do a good smart stat which can modulate the boiler. But control companies want everything in every room. You've got a thermostat in every single room. That's great for them. But yeah, your real good engineers don't like all this zoning. I mean, what they do use a TRV for is a limit stat. So if you've got lots of solar gain coming into that particular room, it can shut things off because you're getting too hot. But microclimating your home with all these different stats everywhere isn't the best way to control a heat pump system. The best way to control a heat pump system is to keep it simple, very simple, open loop, what they call open loop. You enable it in the winter, so you don't really touch it. It's enabled. I mean, people say it's on all the time. It's enabled. So it's a bit like your fridge. You don't wait till everything's cold in your fridge and then rush to unplug it or turn it off, do you? But so your fridge is kind of enabled. It's not always on. Your compressor, you can't always hear that compressor on your fridge. It just does what it needs to do when it needs to do it. And that's what a heat pump system does. It's slowly putting energy into the home when it needs it. It needs, if it's really, really cold outside, it will put more energy into the home. But it knows what's happening because it knows what the weather's doing with an outside sensor. So it's enabled, but it doesn't mean it's always constantly on.
Okay. Yeah, presumably you don't want it to be like we like it to be about 19.5 degrees in some rooms that we're in, but at night you want it to be down to say 16 because you're asleep and you don't want to be sweating under your duvet. So presumably that's still possible, right?
Well, yeah.
You just change the temperature, but you don't zone it. You just have the whole house certain temperature, or you measure it presumably in certain spaces, and you kind of your heat pump works to that data.
Yes, at night time, it's important at night time we have lower temperatures. It's healthy to have lower temperatures at night time. Now, historically, with boiler systems, we're used to a programmer or a time switch where we turn everything off. And then in the morning, it comes on. And the reason we can do that with boiler systems is, again, because it's very high temperatures. We can rush that heat out pretty quickly. But with a heat pump system, you have a setback. So you just set it back. So instead of having your 19.5 degrees in your living room during the day, you set it back to maybe 17 at night. So the system's still enabled. No one's completely turned it off, but it's set itself back. So it's not doing anything until it sort of really drops below that 17 or whatever you set it back to. You don't want to set it back too far, but about 17, 16.5 maybe. So you have it on setback for nighttime temperatures.
Okay. What about the... so another question that I got asked, and actually is quite relevant to ourselves, because we, in the extension bit that we're going to get, I'm thinking, because it's a brand new build, we might as well just get an underfloor heating, but we're not going to rip out all the radiators in the rest of the house. And obviously, I'm sure the underfloor heating was completely different to a radiator, because you get underfloor heating is a massive pipe basically that's buried under your floor. So it's much longer, thicker pipe, I presume. Again, I don't know much about these things. And whereas the radiator is has fairly high resistance when it comes to the water flow, right? Do you need two different systems, and how does that work? Is that much more complicated than just getting radiators everywhere in a house?
No. I mean, basically, they're both heat emitters. Like you say, underfloor heating is basically one long continuous bit of pipe, and it's. I mean, if you are going for underfloor heating, obviously once again, we're a very saturated market, the UK heat industry. So there's lots of underfloor heating manufacturers, and they do design systems themselves. I think they're great at it, a lot of them. I mean, they're sort of kind of a lot of the engineers now. What they will do is put your underfloor heating at 100 centres. So what that means is each pipe is 100 mil from each other. So obviously, the closer you can get them together, you get more surface area, and that means more surface area means you can get lower water temperatures. Exactly the same with a radiator. I mean, if you look at a radiator, it might be a single panel, and then they might have tack welded some fins on it to increase surface area. Then they might have double panel with some fins. Then you might have had two more fins on the other, and then they've got triple. So you're increasing the surface area. Now, obviously, sometimes aesthetically, a rag may look a bit too big, but certain rooms. I mean, this is where having a survey is very interesting, because I might go into one room with some particular occupants, and they might not have these wall-to-wall sofas that go around the corner. And they might not have a lot of wall space for me to put an extra radiator. You don't always have to make that one bigger. You can actually put an extra one in, because I might go in the same house with other occupants that have just got two armchairs. They haven't got sort of wall-to-wall sofas, and they've got that nice extra wall, and they don't mind having another. You can have two radiators in a room. There's no problem with that. You can have three in a room if you want. It's about increasing that surface area, because the more surface area of radiator you can get, the lower your temperatures you can get. And that's one of the secrets you're looking for. You want the lowest temperature you can possibly get going around that system, because that narrows that source and sink temperature. That's when you get your good COPs.
Okay. Yeah, it's all about the COP. Basically, that's what I'm hearing.
Well, it is. If electricity was cheap, it wouldn't matter so much. And this is why solar thermal is very interesting. So I'm a massive advocate of solar thermal. So that's what I'm kind of known for in the UK. Lots of people think winter you can't heat water up. And I always say, if you walk out your home during the daytime, you can see because there's visible light. And next to visible light on the electromagnetic spectrum is infrared. Infrared's always there, and it can heat up water. And in the winter, it's not great at heating up water for showering, your domestic hot water, which is what we usually have been using solar heated water for. But it's great at heating up your heating water, because if we've got low temperature systems, that have got running around, running 30-degree water when it's 10 degrees outside, or running 35-degree water when it's 5 degrees outside. The solar thermal is great at providing some of that energy. And of course, it's free and it's completely clean. You won't get all the big energy companies perhaps wanting it because it is free energy. So the real good engineers out there are designing these sort of real good systems that are combining solar thermal, but not just for your domestic hot water you're washing, but to actually go into your input into your heating system. And sometimes they've got whole days of the winter that are just completely running off the winter sun.
Yeah, I've seen those panels, around, and you don't see too many of them. But I presume it's the same. It's the same principle as if you had like a glass house or a small room in the sort of in the western side of the house that gets a lot of sun during the day, and even in the winter, that room's going to be very hot from just purely from the sun itself. And it's the same principle, right? But I must ask the people who are looking at our heat pump installation about it. I do wonder how complex it is to add it to an existing heat pump or to a heat pump system, as opposed to just running it off electricity alone. Are all heat pump systems kind of capable of having another source of hot water like solar panels, or is it something you have to specifically source a heat pump that actually can deal with that? That makes sense.
No, so some manufacturers are better than others at being able to integrate different technology. I mean, but you've picked up on a really important point there, that heating is a system. It really is a system. So we've got stuck with this notion that heat pumps are efficient, and it has to be an efficient heat pump, and what manufacturer makes the best heat pump, and what boiler is the most efficient. And it doesn't really matter. I use the analogy of my younger brother. My younger brother's extremely fit. He did his sort of bleep test at the SAS. He wasn't in the SAS. He played for Hereford United, and they used to do all their fitness training at the SAS camp. Now, he's got a resting heartbeat still at 46 of around 39. So high 30s, low 40s. Really, really super duper efficient heart, my little brother. But if you put his heart, this super duper efficient heart, into my body, which unfortunately is a bit overweight, I won't be efficient. And that's exactly the same with heating. It doesn't matter how efficient your boiler is, whether it's A+++, or how efficient your heat pump is. It's how the system has been designed. It's the system that makes things efficient. So a lot of people ask me, quite high level as well, Nate, what's the best heat pump out there? And I always say to them, if you wanted a portrait of your family, with acrylic or sort of oil paints, you wouldn't ask what's the best paint. You'd ask who's the best artist. And it's exactly the same with the heat pump system. You want a really good engineer to design that and put that in. Nothing to do with the heat pump, really. Don't get me wrong, there's some that are, but there's much of a muchness. There's not one that's major better than any other. But heating is a system. So yeah, a designer, if you've got this, it usually comes down to space. If you've got the space for like a buffer where they can actually input some solar energy into, they're going to be able to design that for you. But once again, it gets more complex, and then poor old consumers, and how do you know who's really, really good? Maybe I should write.
Yeah,
maybe
that's quite often the problem. How do you?
maybe I should do a maybe I should do a 10-point checklist for consumers about how to spot a good engineer. I might have to do that.
Yeah, I think that would be very useful, because it is a question. I ask loads of questions, and I'm kind of engineering minded, so I can spot when somebody's just like telling me something they read, and if everybody tells me the same thing, but I know they don't know why their answers is a certain answer, then I kind of know that they have no idea what they're talking about. Whereas with somebody tells me something different, but they know why, I'd rather talk to that person. But I'm sure it's more complex in the end. We seem to have a massive shortage, or everyone tells me that there's a shortage of heating engineers these days. Do you think that's going to be solved anytime soon? Do you think we're going to see a massive transition of all the gas engineers into heating, or being proper heating engineers rather than just plumbers who fit gas boilers?
It's a big challenge. One of the big challenges is and this is what I sort of talk to industry about, and sometimes I feel like I'm talking to a brick wall, but people are starting to listen, is this whole notion of training and how we train people. And understandably, we all think with the educational model. So we all think training is about a bit like school or college or university. You go somewhere and you listen to an expert. So I'm a lecturer, I'm a qualified lecturer, but that's not really how learning works. If you go on a 3-day course and you just got me standing at the front and I'm giving out all this information, that's you just listening. And often when we're listening, we can be thinking about, was it me supposed to be walking the dog tonight, or am I supposed to be cooking the dinner? It's passive learning, and we need to get away from that model. It's educational psychological research for decades has told us that has a very low impact on learning. That kind of model, lecture, instructional teaching from the front. You need to make training active and engaging, and the way you usually do that is with questions, and you get people involved in discussing rather well. Now the trouble with that is it's very time consuming, and education and training is an industry. They don't want things to be time consuming. They want you in and out because that's where their money's made, and we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry worldwide. Training in vocations, it really is a very lucrative industry. So that model doesn't work. It's never going to work properly. So if you want really super duper engineers, you've got to really break that paradigm of how you do training or how you think about training. And you can't. So it's not just about going on a course is just the start of a learning journey. It really is. And one of the things you need to realize also with learning, the ownership is on the person. The ownership is on the learner. That doesn't matter whether you want to learn piano, violin, be the world's best footballer. You're not going to be the world's best footballer by turning up to a 2-week boot camp every summer holiday and going to your club every Saturday and Sunday. You become the world's best footballer because you invest time every night practicing with that ball. It's the same with our industry. Now, our industry is a little bit different. It's not like blacksmiths or plastering where it's a muscle memory. You're learning. The muscle memory is actually your brain. There's so much knowledge in our industry, and the only reason you're going to keep that in our brain, because brains are designed to forget, that's called the forgetting curve. The only way you're going to keep that in your brain is to keep immersed in it, keep chatting about it. So you'll find the top engineers constantly are chatting about stuff. And this is wonderful. And this is what my platform does, my learning platform. It brings people together as a hive mindset. So if there is a challenging thing, they're chatting with each other about it. I've got artificial intelligence in the background that's monitoring what people are chatting about. And then it rewards them with digital credentials, So let's say in the future, a consumer wants someone that's competent. And there's an engineer that's got a digital credential, which they can verify on an email or on a quote. These digital credentials are called open badges. And you've got someone that's been chatting for 300 hours over the last 3 years about how you would use a solar thermal system, for instance, with a heat pump. They're more likely to be more competent than someone that's just gone out and got a certificate in 3 days. Because unfortunately, in our industry, it's very easy to go out and get that certificate. You're only assessed with a what they call multiple choice assessment, and you can't fail. If you get them questions wrong, you're given another chance and another chance and another chance till you get them right. So you can't fail. And of course, everyone then gets their money. The certificate companies gets their money. The training centre gets their money. So it's a strange industry. So the secret is to find out who is conscientiously.
Certification industries.
Oh yeah, but that's not to say. I mean, there's this other argument that people need to have an apprenticeship to be really good in this industry. No, you don't. And actually, apprenticeships have actually created a bit of a problem because, I've taught a lot of apprentices. You've got apprentices that they don't learn at college. Their main learning facilitator is at work, their employer. But if you're apprentices with an employer that actually doesn't know too much, they're going to perpetuate that problem. They end up not knowing too much. So everyone thinks apprenticeships is this panacea. Well, if you're putting an apprentice with a low-skilled company, that perpetuates the problem. So that's not the answer either. So it's a challenge. But the biggest thing is you've got to find engineers that are conscientiously passionate about maintaining their learning and not just thinking, I've gone on the course, I can now make lots of money putting a heat pump. You want engineers, the men and women out there that are really passionate about maintaining that learning, and that's sort of kind of what my platform hopes to do, which is only just launched, and then I've got some sponsors coming on that are going to sponsor people's learning journey on it.
I'm going to put a link in the description because I had a look. Obviously, it's not something that I'm interested in full time, but presumably, if anyone's listening or watching and they're interested in being a heating engineer, they should look at platforms like yourselves to get some ideas on what they can do. Because like everyone keeps on telling me, and you're telling me that as well, is that it's a bit more of an engineering platform rather than just being or a skill than just being a plumber essentially.
Well, I mean,
And that's very important.
that's a good point. I mean, a lot of people think the skill of plumbing is being able to solder and being able to bend pipe. I mean, not being funny. I used to teach, teaching colleges, and I've taught a lot of students how to solder. Soldering isn't, if a welder heard people say, "Oh, soldering's a real great skill." Well, no, it's not. Welding is a fantastic skill. Don't get me wrong. Soldering and bending pipe is just much of a muchness. And yes, you're right. People can train. I mean, if you look at some of the consumers, the early adopters like yourself into EVs, and some of these early adopters that have got into heat pumps and bought heat pumps, some of them are unbelievable because they've got mathematical minds. They might come from a physical background. They know heat, but they know it so well. So yeah, you're going to be able to have people transition from other areas, especially in the design. I mean, not everyone is kind of hands-on and mechanical, and you have to know building fabric as well. I mean, one of the big skills is being able to walk the building and think, "Oh, should I run pipes through that wall? What this wall? How do I cut through that?" Da, 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 da. So what people think is the skill of plumbing, like bending pipe and soldering, isn't really. It's the knowledge, and especially things around water regs. A lot of people actually don't know water regulations. I mean, for all your listeners, if your shower hose reaches your toilet, for instance, that's a big breach of water regulations. But the amount of baths I see where they got the shower, the mixer tap with the shower connection to it, and it can reach your toilet, category 5 breach. But this, and I see it in hotels, and I do say to the hotel, "I'm not paying this bill," and they go, "Why is that?" So if I rung up your local water authority, you're going to get fined quite a lot of money. So yeah, I've managed to get free hotels quite a bit for that.
Interesting. Because I have to ask you that. What do you think about all this sort of hype around hydrogen boilers? Do you think that's going to go anywhere, or is it just a fad that because I'm worried sometimes that if I look at the history of technological progress in the world, not always the best and the most not always the best ideas win. Sometimes people push for things that aren't that great, but they kind of work if you just force them. And I'm just worried that hydrogen is one of those things that's stopping people from adopting heat pumps, and it's going to be potentially not the best solution, but the one that's going to be pushed by the industry because it's the easiest or whatever. What is your professional opinion on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So obviously our industry has been polarised with that debate, and you've got lobbyists on both parties. I mean, there's heat pump lobbyists and there's the hydrogen lobbyists, and actually they're quite a slick lobby group because they're the incumbents. But it's actually petered down. That sort of the bickering, I think, has petered down a little bit. So obviously it makes sense to, hydrogen is actually quite a fantastic thing to study. So it makes sense to keep studying it, and maybe with the discourse around it might be used for heat. I don't think it's ever going to be used for heat in mass scale at all. That's my personal professional opinion. I don't. It will be used in certain hubs. It's going to be great for industry and other uses, but it's not going to be like what we see with natural gas and what we saw earlier with town gas back in the day. Don't get me wrong. While they maintain that story, lots of things are happening. So obviously they're upgrading the grid. Lots of people make money from upgrading the grid, so they're going to maintain that story. I think it's still important to study hydrogen from as much as we might argue it's not going to be used mass scale for boilers in homes. There's still things they're going to learn from it, from studying it and all that sort of stuff. But it did get quite intense, the arguments. I think what's happened is, so that if you look at some of the main bodies in heating that are very entrenched with sort of the gas supply network, I think they realised they've been arguing against physics a little bit. So when the heat pump people come along and said, you have had an established heating industry, for instance, saying heat pumps can't work unless they're in buildings that are EPCC, not realising they're actually saying that in offices that are being heated and cooled with VRF technology, like I've just said. They're being heated and cooled with. I mean, the Federation of Master Builders did it not so long ago. They wrote a massive damning report about heat pumps, and their offices in London are getting heated with VRF technology. And there's pictures of it on Google. So I think it's quieting down a little bit. It's interesting. The boiler industry in a bit of a funny situation. When you talk about heat pumps, there's kind of 3 categories. There's traditional HVAC manufacturers that have been making this, what everyone calls air conditioning stuff. So that's people like Toshiba, Hitachi, Panasonic, Daikin, LG, Mitsubishi, all these sort of people. You've then got the boiler manufacturers like Vaillant and Wiesmann that make this stuff. I mean, Bosch uses IVT, which is Swedish technology, Mr. Bosch. They're all part of groups. So like people like Ideal is the biggest boiler manufacturer in this or seller in this country. You know, they're part of Atlantic Group, which makes heat pumps. Lots of French manufacturers in that. And then you've got the standalone heat pump manufacturers, people like Nibe, IVT. So you've got these kind of three different. So I think what you're going to see is so the interesting thing is the boiler manufacturers. Obviously, they've been used to selling lots of boilers, so they're going to try and maintain that sort of. They need to maintain themselves. I mean, I think one of the things we're going to see, we might see a few big players fall because we can't maintain 1.7, 1.9 million boilers a year. And they're kind of, the boiler industry's been caught with its pants down, really. We've been shoving these boilers in. People are used to now, I was talking to someone I know, he used to be on the news desk at the BBC, and, he's had 3 boilers in 15 years. 3 boilers in 15 years. Because we've got a society now that's if they break down, they put a new one on. We can't go on. That's not sustainable. That growth is no longer sustainable. So I think the heat industry now, it's getting looked at and scrutinised, is having to sort of change the way they think a little bit.
Okay. I think that's true for loads of industries where we're used to just buying things, and if it breaks down, we just replace it instead of going and fix it. And I remember when I was young. I mean, granted, I grew up in a different country and under communism, so completely different realms, like of availability of things. But if anything broke, you knew somebody who could fix it, or you went to a shop down there in a high street where people were able to fix it for you. So it was a completely different world, and it feels like ages away, but it wasn't that long ago. And we need to go back to that because I think that's the only way forwards. We need to. I think we need to start realizing that things cost more, but they last longer, and I think that's the same probably true for heat pumps. Last question, because we've been talking for quite a long time. I'm conscious of your time. If anyone's interested in like getting a heat pump for their house and they have no idea what to do, what would you tell them? Like if somebody met you on the street and said, "Oh, you know a lot about heating and you talk to heating engineers, what should I do to get a heat pump?" Like, what would be your advice?
Well, the first thing you should always do is understand the heat loss of your home. And that's with any heating system. You need to know how much heat your home loses at certain temperatures. So you need to work out the heat loss. And there's various ways of doing that. You can calculate it. You can, even good people that know building fabric can sometimes be a bit way out with calculations. That there are ways you can measure heat loss, but you kind of need to know that figure first, and then you can design from there. So that's the first thing. Yeah, like I say, I bet I should really do some advice for consumers about how to spot good engineers as well, because I think that's something that they really, really need. It's very, very hard for the consumer. Very hard.
Yeah.
And of course, what's going to be a big problem there? I mean, one thing is if you think that you've got a salesman come round, because obviously the bigger companies are going to use salespeople to come around, a bit like the window industry. Well, not knocking the window industry, but they'd have a salesperson come around. So you're going to get companies like that will have a salesperson come around and sort of, they're clever people, salespeople. They're trying to condition you into sort of doing something, aren't they? But you can kind of spot them as well, and that's not really what you want. You want someone that comes around and kind of you get the impression they know what they're on about. And there's some little tactics of understanding that, but it's probably be quite complex for me. I'll have to get, like I say, I probably should write something down for people, like a little blog. I mean, they can go to my website, not my website, my podcast, BetaTalk, and you'll hear engineers chatting on there. Sometimes it's getting a bit too technical. I try and sort of dumb it down for the sort of whole wider audience. But don't get put off. Don't think they don't work, because they do. They are going to cost you a bit more money, and the more disruptive, it's going to cost you a bit more money. But yeah, they do work, and it's something you should think about. So yeah, if you ain't got to rush out and do it yet. I mean, you can start to research this sort of stuff. And like I say, I should really get some consumer stuff up on my website just to help them out a bit, because that's like they are struggling. Engineers, I would point out. I would point out engineers struggle with consumers as well, because there are some consumers that want the world. They really want the world. And then, the engineer goes round and you've got consumers say, well, you've only been here for 2 days. Why am I paying you this? Not realising they've spent like ages and ages trying to procure the stuff, get stuff in and organise this with the planning and the DNO applications and designing it. Society is probably the most complex, heterogeneous cohort there is out there.
Yeah. I think loads of people have been scarred by having bad experiences with professional tradesmen, sorry, and they're trying to be on it basically, and unfortunately when you're scaled you kind of have to learn to live with that and understand that. But yeah, like I say, there isn't an easy answer, because I've been trying to think of if there's anything I can do to help, and I'm just a podcaster doing this on the side. This is just me trying to talk to people and share share my thoughts and share my my interviews or my conversations with people. But I'm not a heating engineer, and everyone has loads of questions. Like whenever I talk about heat pumps, it's a struggle to find anyone to even talk to you or respond to your emails quite often. And once you find anybody, you have to keep on chasing them. Everyone's very busy. There aren't enough of them around. So I think that needs to change for things to improve. So if you think about adding something like that to your website, I'll be happy to share that, because I think that would be very helpful to have a couple of points that will help people understand that heat pumps work basically.
Yeah, what I should do an episode actually about what consumers can do, how they can ascertain a good. But they're in the same boat as everyone. I mean, I have emails from like high up senior people in this discourse. Whether they're senior executive people at OVO or Energy Systems Catapult or Energy Savings Trust. I've had special advisor to 2 energy secretaries. They all get hold of me. Nathan, who's a good heat pump engineer in this area? Because they all realise the problem. They realise now is, how do you know who a good one is and where are they? So I should really do an episode on that for consumers. I haven't done that yet. I don't know why I haven't done that yet.
Yeah. and for anyone who's like afraid, you're because I'm listening to your podcast as well, and your episodes are very approachable. Like you talk inside baseball sometimes, but you don't talk about super complex physics, and you don't use you use the jargon, but it's not something that a mere mortal is not going to be able to understand. So I think they should listen to your podcast if they're interested in heat pumps, because you're going to learn quite a lot.
Yeah, I try and cater for everyone. I mean, bearing in mind your listeners, anyone that sort of a lot of people that are driving EVs are actually quite super clever people that are, the early adopters or the innovators are the first people on the adoption curve, aren't they? I mean, these people, they're more technical than me. I mean, when you start talking about PV and batteries, I've just done an episode on that. I mean, that's a lot of it's going over my head. It really is, and I don't know a lot about EVs. I probably drove a Tesla before I didn't drive it. I was in the past. So Tesla had I grew up in Norfolk, so I used to work at Lotus actually a long time ago. So Heffel, where Lotus is based, had a Tesla thing going on there. The time when what's that car program everyone likes with Jerry Clarkson years and years ago? So it was at that time when they did the Tesla, and I think they sort of slated Tesla a little bit, but
they did, and they got sued for it.
They did. Well, my friend was the personal assistant to the top person at Tesla at Lotus, so she would get to drive that Tesla home, and we'd drive out to a pub in it. So yeah, I mean, I probably didn't realise at the time I was driving quite a famous Tesla. I don't know. I don't know anything about EVs. I really don't. I don't.
They know that's complicated, as people think. But you're right. I think this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, is because I've got loads of people who have an EV, and like I said at the beginning, they're looking at improving their lives, and they want to have a heat pump just purely because it's it's a better way of living. Like I remember as a child, I always hated the fact that radiators were so hot in a house. It kind of because when you're a little person and you're approaching a big thing that radiates a lot of heat, it's not a nice feeling. It wasn't to me.
It's not healthy. It's not healthy.
Well, yeah.
If you grew up in You would have grown up in Poland. Poland have
Yeah.
a lot of district heating, third generation district heating systems. So yeah, you would have been used to very hot.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's not healthy because it creates convection currents. All the dust is getting churned up. So I mean, the Asthma Society years and years ago, all these people with very bad asthma when they go and live there. That there's no radiators in sight. It's all underfloor heat because it's low. It has to be low temperature because you're not churning up the dust with these convection currents. So and that you can do that with radiators. You just drop the temperature. You need lower temperatures, and you're heating your room up to 20. And like I said, heat moves from hot to cold. So if you've got 30 degrees in your rads, it's still heating your room up. You might need a little bit more in your rads if you ain't got the surface area and it's a little bit colder outside. It's always dependent on what the outside temperature is.
Yeah, but my point is that it's much nicer to have a radiator that 30 degrees than one at 60. It's just a pure I mean that's just personal bias, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who has that feeling, and it's not something that you realize until your house is switched over to a lower heating. Anybody who I know who has a heat pump, I walk into their house and I kind of instantly feel better, and you just don't know why. But it's one of those things that contributes to that feeling. Anyway, because as you can tell, I can talk for hours, and I'm sure you've got something else to do. So I thank you for answering all my questions, and hopefully there's going to be some people coming from my platform to your platform and kind of asking questions, or maybe even willing to become heating engineers. I think we need more engineers in general in the world, smart, clever people, and heating engineers are just one of those cohorts that we need more of them. So thank you, Nathan.
Thank you for inviting me on. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. As always, if you're still listening to this, you're awesome. If you're watching, you're even awesome. Subscribe, hit that bell notification thingy, whatever your podcasting or YouTube thing machine tells you to do. Patreon.com/takeitev and look at the description for all the relevant links. Ta-da.